Hello, my name is Gavin. I was recently in England with Penny Rimbaud, the guy who started Crass and arguably the anarcho-punk movement. And he was talking about a friend of his named Wally who was assassinated by the police in 1974. I was fascinated by this story, so I set up my computer with a photo booth or whatever the software that comes with your camera, and I recorded him for 5 hours telling the story of Wally Hope's assassination and how that begot Crass. So the short version is, he started the Stonehenge festival, and that angered the authorities.
Mm-hmm.
Then he was taken away to a mental institution.
No, he turned up one day with this idea of doing a festival at Stonehenge. Somewhat embarrassed the authorities during that short period.
Why would the Department of the Environment care about a festival at Stonehenge?
Well, at that time it's quite interesting because really Stonehenge was pretty much just a lump of stones and no one cared a fuck about them in those days.
Grass overgrown. It was
Yeah,
just in
sort
the
of.
forest.
Yeah, it wasn't like a showcase, English heritage showcase. I mean, I think Wally would weep if he knew what had happened to it now because it's turned into a sort of amusement park. Anyway, he wanted it there because it was quiet. I mean, there'd been these free festivals at Windsor, which was in the backyard of the Queen's Palace. You know, well, obviously that was a political decision on the people who set up the Windsor Free Festivals. They lasted for 2 years, and then there was a massive, or maybe 3 years, of massive and very violent confrontation between the police and the festival goers. Wally actually got beaten up badly at that festival. Turned up here. That's when he started hatching the idea of doing Stonehenge. Because Stonehenge was away from everywhere. Who'd care a fuck if, 1,000 hippies turned up in the middle of nowhere? In American terms, it would be like doing something in the middle of the Nevada desert. Who's going to care about that, really? One of the big mistakes was, which at the time we were unaware, all of us were unaware of, was actually that the Ministry of Defence have got their major chemical laboratories for chemical warfare very close to the Stonehenge in Portland Down.
So now we have two good reasons. One is that you antagonize the Queen, and two is that you're near our laboratories.
Yeah, I mean, when you say antagonise the Queen, certainly antagonise the authorities, yes. We have two. There were other reasons as well. I mean, at the time, there was a general sense of unrest. It was only four years since, the summer of '68. And so that was still in the air. The authorities, one says, well, how could they have occurred? They only need to look back to Paris, and that was quite, and what was going on in England and America, everywhere, the late '60s, there'd been a pretty strong and sometimes very active, stroke violent movement against established authority. And I think that probably the authorities throughout the West were, stamping hard on anything that looked like a repeat program.
They were floundering.
Yes, they were. So anyway, Wally had this idea of doing Stonehenge. At first, I thought it was a fucking stupid idea. Who'd want to go? I didn't want to go, but he was so enthusiastic that eventually I got convinced by it. And so we agreed to, work on it from here. So we set up the first one. That went off, and as I've already said, they got shoved off by the Department of Environment, who possibly were the MOD in those days, or anyway, one of the authorities.
What does MOD stand for?
Ministry of Defence.
Oh.
Went through the High Court in London. It was a big story in the papers. It was sort of middle of summer when it's called a silly period in the news industry, because nothing much happens in August. So it was a good story, and every day the Wallies were coming out of the High Court saying, we win, whatever happens, we win, we can't lose, blah, blah, blah. So they were an embarrassment. Wally also got involved with a group called the Tartan Army. He was politically naive and was unaware of the fact that the Tartan Army were the Scottish equivalent to the IRA. He got stopped, actually not far from Stonehenge, he stopped the night to stay in a squat. His car was, rainbow painted, had the teppy on top. It was well known. It was well known in London when he was handing out, pamphlets and leaflets advertising the festival. It was an obvious thing. Well, that parked outside a squat would have been noticed very quickly indeed by the authorities. The house was raided by the military police. The military police don't actually have rights over civilians, but they did arrest him. They said that they were looking for a deserter. That was their reason for getting into the house. They discovered what it differs between in different reports from 1 to 4 tabs of acid in his coat pocket. He was arrested, taken to Salisbury, Nick. He was refused any phone calls, any contact, which of course is, a civil right to have one phone call, which he was refused, and he was put on remand, sort of pushed through the courts very quickly, put on remand, and then, whilst he was on remand, he was sent to the psychiatrist on the reason he didn't want to wear prison clothing. Well, there's an anachronism here, because actually people on remand don't have to wear prison clothing. Now, we didn't hear of Wally's fate. As far as we knew, he had left here, headed off down to Stonehenge and beyond, to rest up before the festival. And it wasn't for about 2 weeks that his guardian got in touch with us and said, "Are you aware that Wally's been cased up?" My reaction was, they're going to do him in. I just felt that from the very start. This is a deliberate political act. They've just taken him out, and they're going to do the job. G eventually decided that she'd try a shot at being Wally's sister, which she got away with. So she managed to get access into the hospital and talk to Wally. And then she came back and reported his condition as being absolutely appalling. He was almost unable to sort of speak coherently. He'd already begun to become bloated. All of these, the effects of the drugs.
Well, those pictures you showed me are amazing, the before and after. And that was a matter of, 4 months? Or something?
Less than that. No more than 3 months.
Jesus.
In that short 2 weeks, he'd become dangerously ill. At this point, we knew we had to get him out. So for the next few days, we started working on how. We knew that if we could get him out for 28 days, then actually he was free, unless he was recaptured and then resectioned. But that's part of the thing of sectioning, that it has to be assessed. And if you're not there for the assessment, then it sort of gets put in the bin, or at least that was the case then. So we knew if we can get him away, then he certainly can be safe. But we knew that we couldn't keep him in this country in case they did decide to sort of really make an effort to find him. In any case, he'd have insisted on going to the festival and would have immediately been arrested there. So we got in contact with people we knew. We'd arranged for a boat, to take him from the east coast near here, on a small harbour where no one would have noticed, a sort of pleasure boat going out, to take him across to Holland, and then from Holland we were going to take him across Europe down to Spain. So that was going to be our thing.
To hide him there.
Yeah, to try and. We knew he was no longer, in good health. So it would also be a good place to sort of, start trying to mend him. Anyway, so then G and myself went down to the hospital, and obviously we had to have some agreement from him as to our plans. The plan was pretty comprehensive. It didn't actually require anything more, which would have been a hard job because he was under surveillance all the time. But it wasn't impossible. Possibly, we thought, well, maybe 2 cars, one as a fake car, one as the real car, other cars parked so we can change cars, and probably getting him out of the actual building.
It's a clandestine operation.
Yeah.
I think as a modern skeptic, your first instinct is to say the government is not competent enough to conduct these assassinations. And as far as today is concerned, I'm inclined to not just agree with that, but be one of those people. But you have to put it in perspective of the late 60s. These people were police, Secret Service that had been educated and trained 10, 20 years before. The books that they were reading were from 20 years before that. So to them, rebellion wasn't just some silly hippie, the ones we would think of today having a festival. It was a genuine threat. I mean, their history was World War II, their history was the Depression, their history was the Industrial Revolution. So the class system in Britain back then was what we think of today as a parody of the class system. I mean, the head of EMI would be a lord, and he'd be sitting there smoking his pipe in a salon with all the other sirs conducting the business of the economy. Today that sounds ridiculous, and I think it's a misnomer to assume that that is still the case. But in 1974, when Wally Hope was killed, it was not absurd for someone to be genuinely threatened by a freak, because he was the first freak.
Making the compromises. What did you know? What did you care? Brave fronts, deceitful disguises.
You know, and I had no real experience of, psychiatric, the psychiatric world. I had certainly no experience of sort of, secret police and MI5 activities and all that sort of stuff. I was young, naive, and concerned. Anyway, so he'd have none of it. He absolutely refused to enter into it. He said, he didn't feel well enough, which seemed ridiculous, knowing that, well, he wouldn't have known that he was going to get sicker and sicker. But he also had this sort of stupid belief that somehow or other he was going to come through it. Maybe he had to have that belief because it was like being in a fucking nightmare. But so effectively, we realised that without at least his passive agreement, there was no way we were going to get him out. If he was going to be screaming and yelling, no chance. So, I mean, that was a fucking awful decision to have to make. But we then thought, okay, well, we can't help. At that point, we tried to get a lawyer involved, who was an old school friend of mine, with a particular interest in sort of civil abuse. The abuse of civil liberties. And he found it almost impossible to get through to anyone or anything. He just found himself coming up against blank walls all the time. None of his messages got through, none of the return messages he ever received. And that finally proved beyond any doubt that this was a setup. Yeah. Anyway, I got one or two frazzled letters from the mental institution, from Wally, which seemed to become, more and more. I mean, he always would write pretty crazy letters, but he was perfectly capable of being completely straight if he wanted to be. I mean, he liked talking in riddles, etc., etc. But anyway, it was obvious that he was going to be ruined. The festival took place, and it was thousands of people turned up, and it was absolutely beautiful. It was lots of bands came and played. There was lots of free food. Nothing, there was no money changing hands. And it was just a great, amazing gathering of people. It was beautiful, beautiful weather. I went down with a filmmaker called Mick, who became the filmmaker for Crass, in the hope of, to document the festival so that Wally would be able to see it. Wally, we have to remember, was 10 miles down the road in a mental institution, in a cell, basically. But our other reason to go there was to try and recruit. We thought, well, we should do a march from the festival, do a march, 10 miles, and make a protest outside the mental hospital. We were two guys wandering around with watches on and cameras.
Oh, shit.
And halfway through the second day, we heard an announcement from the stage where you will have noticed two guys wandering around, then an exact description of Mick and myself. Don't talk to them. They're police. So, at which point, you know, what had been sort of really a, you know, nice day out, a nice couple of days out, turned into a fucking nightmare. No one would talk to us. People would just shun us. You know, didn't feel dangerous.
Right, but you couldn't do anything.
There was nothing we could do, so we left. The festival went on for about a week. On the day, you know, over the solstice, so let's say that, I can't remember the exact date, but say it was the 27th when the last hippie drew out from the site. In other words, the site was closed in the sense that there wasn't anyone there anymore. Wally was released, miraculously cured. You know, he no longer was a schizophrenic. It took him 2 days. I don't know how he ever did it, to drive back. He got his car back, which had been impounded by the police, and drove back here. I mean, he apparently could drive for about 20 minutes, then would just have to stop, lie down, rest, and then do the next little bit. I mean, it's about 100. I suppose it's about 100 miles from here to. So he arrived here, and he was just ruined. I will never know how he managed to drive that distance.
Well, you said he couldn't really walk.
No,
his left arm would follow his left leg.
He'd still got, at a very base level, he'd got a modicum of sense. You know, he wasn't like a sort of complete moron, but, you know, anything out of the modicum of sense. You know, in other words, he could eat, but he would eat sloppily. He didn't know what he wanted to eat. You know, he'd lost all of those things, but, you know, all of those sort of biological drives were still functioning. But he'd cry all night. You know, he was just miserable. I mean, he was ruined, basically. After about 2 weeks, it was unprecedented that the government decided to create a festival site in a place called Watchfield, which was, I think it was Watchfield, an old RAF military base, Royal Air Force military base. And clearly, the idea was then, okay, we'll allow them this, and we'll disallow them anything else, you know, and we can control it, we can keep an eye on everything that happens, we can monitor it. You know, this is a dangerous potential movement. The Free Festival movement, you know, has already proved itself in Windsor with the violence there. Had already proved itself at Stonehenge, that in 1 year it went from 100. You know, sort of vagrants into a genuine festival of several thousand.
So he made it to this festival, this government-sanctioned festival. It was sort of a duplicate of Stonehenge, but owned by the government.
Yeah.
And he did an interview with a local video. What was that?
I think it was just some sort of like alternative news outfit.
Okay.
You know,
just like you going to the first festival with Mick with a camera.
Effectively, yeah.
And they interviewed him, and he was not really himself, but he did say some dangerous things.
No, I don't think he probably said anything dangerous, but I mean his very presence there. I mean, if it were the case, and I believe it was, that they intended to put him out of action, well, he'd just gone into action again. Right. You know, he turned up at the festival. Everyone knew him, of course. You know, he was the sort of, you know, mythological creator of Stonehenge. So he was, you know, one of the elite. Well, suddenly one of the elite turns up, and everyone's going to notice. And they certainly would have noticed him. He left quite soon because he, you know, wasn't up for staying long, and actually called in here, but then headed back to his guardians to stay there for a while. And then I can't remember how long after that, but you know, he was dead. He was found dead, drowned in his own vomit, on the kitchen floor of the Hatfields' house. It was an unusual occasion when there hadn't been anyone else in the house. And almost from the start, it didn't fit. It didn't work. I mean, the most obvious thing was that it took them, well, actually, in the end, it took months for them to actually say, well, it was sleeping tablets. Well, I mean, you or I know that if someone takes a dose of sleeping tablets, within 10 minutes, you know, any coroner...
It's not a strange drug to OD on.
No. I don't know how I managed, possibly because of the fact his guardianship, that Dr. Hatfield must have got the police papers. But one of the things I immediately noticed, as did the doctor, was a needle mark on Wally's arm. Well, there's no way at all in which Wally ever would have used needles. It just was absolutely unthinkable. And certainly no one in the hospital had used needles on his arm. I mean, he had needles in his arse, I think, for Modica, when they were forcing him to take Modica. But there was one single mark on his arm. Well, that, you know, possibly wouldn't have been particularly interesting if it hadn't disappeared from subsequent reports. You know, so the needle marks on his arse remained part of the report, but the needle mark on his arm didn't. You know, so that immediately put that under suspicion. And whereas to some extent, you know, to some extent, you know, some of the talk was about suicide, it was almost unbelievable that it could be the case. I mean, his guardian said, no, it's just not possible. He wasn't in that sort of state. Other people who knew him from the past said no, but possibly not in the present, you know, confirmed that. And the key for me was Wally being the personality that he was, and knowing that even, you know, at his worst, when he was in hospital, he was still sending me, you know, crazy notes. He, without any question, would have written something. He was that sort of personality. He wouldn't have gone without a scream, you know, without his last prayer or something or other. He would have done it. He would have had to have done. So it was already beginning not to key up. You know, but we were young, and, you know, like the 70s, we were still learning. We were, you know, we were very naive to, you know, political intrigue, for example. You know, it was unthinkable. You know, I come from a middle-class background. It's unthinkable that people do things like that to us.
Right.
So anyway, in the coroner's, I mean, that was a sort of like a pantomime out of Alice in Wonderland. The actual court hearing, Dr. Scott was no longer available because he had left and gone to Australia. The investigating officer claimed in the court that he had spoken at length with all parties concerned with Wally since his being freed from the mental institution. Not once had that particular inspector visited Dial House.
Or the Guardian.
Or the Guardian. Etc., etc. And they absolutely would not hear of any objection. You know, we tried to make objections and they just, you know, basically closed the book and walked out. You know, there was no effort whatsoever at any form of justice. The authorities had seen in Watchfield, they weren't pleased that, you know, in the sense that they hadn't achieved their end, and that was to put him out of operation, you know, to cosh him chemically out of the picture. He'd turned up again. They followed him, waited. It was very unusual that the house was empty. And at the point at which it was empty one evening, they went round to the back door rather than using the front door where they might have been seen. Knocked on that door. Wally heard it. He was upstairs. That's where his room was. He came down, opened the door. They came in, injected him, waited until it was quite clear that, you know, they'd done the right job this time, went back, obviously didn't lock the door because they wouldn't have been able to, and left. I was living here on my own at the time, writing the book, and then just one day I thought, I just can't fucking take this. I'd received 2 death threats, and I didn't want any more.
What kind of death threats?
well, one of them wasn't, it was just someone turning up to do the job, and I was, sharp enough to notice as she put her hand in the bag that, she was going to come out with a weapon, and it was a weapon.
What was it?
A knife.
They said a woman to stab you.
Yeah, we actually managed to pacify her, and she later, said that, yeah, that's what she'd come to do, was to finish me off. The other ones were much more covert, the other threats.
How are we doing?
Sorry, I got to stop because Ron rang.
Oh, yeah.
And I said you would ring before. She said I would rather you rang her.
The bad news with extinguishing your naivete is that innocence is lost. But the good news is that it spurred some real anger that essentially generated Crass.
Yeah, but I don't want to jump there yet. I mean, we're under a time sort of confine now, so let's finish with that woman visiting.
Okay.
Because that's good, in my head that's really good, because I can easily key back into that point.
Oh, great.
Yeah?
Okay.
Yeah, great.
If they had picked on someone who was a genuine threat, maybe there'd be more understanding from the hippies. But the fact that they had chosen someone like Wally, just a silly rich kid living on his dad's inheritance, running around, talking about the sun, sending funny notes to people with no agenda whatsoever. The fact that he was extinguished by the authorities is what made people really mad. And my belief is that before Wally Hope, Penny was just an art school kid. He was just a guy who wanted to make fun, avant-garde music and shock people and be weird. But when he saw someone as innocent as Wally get assassinated, he became furious. And that you hear that rage in Crass. And that's what got him with Steve Ignorant. And that's what really pushed the band forward.
Action!
Okay, so it got to the point, Wally's died, he'd been jugged up.
You tackled we didn't get into too much detail with this woman who reached into her purse.
Yeah, okay, so basically speaking, I've been investigating this and the death of another Wally, getting all these connections between gangland and the Essex police, finding out a lot of sort of really bad news about the psychiatric profession, etc., etc. And then out of the blue, well, not entirely out of the blue, taxi pulls up outside the house, woman gets out, comes up, we see her from the window, I recognise her, and she puts her hand in the bag when she gets in, and we were on red alert because it was just sort of strange circumstances. And
we should also say that for someone to pull up in a taxi in front of here, it's not like pulling up in somewhere in London. This is
no. I mean, it's
a mile
private,
of winding roads.
Yeah, sure. And anyway, she had the knife in her hand, and we managed to pacify her, and eventually, actually had a good talk. I mean, it was all connected with the death of the other guy, this other Wally. And so that plus sort of like veiled threats from the police, was making stuff really heavy. I was getting more and more miserable because you can't investigate the death of a friend without getting miserable. And it really, up until that, I'd believed that through doing what we were doing, which was, living in a very peaceable way, creating our own food in the vegetable patch, that was enough, that it was enough simply to be a good person and do good things, and at the time we had a band, a sort of pantomime theatre which used to travel around Britain, and that was promoting our ideas. I mean, it was in a way a much more radical band than Crass ever was, in the sense that it, certainly didn't attempt to explain itself. It used guerrilla tactics. It would just turn up at places and do a gig and then go away, and sometimes people didn't even notice we'd done it.
So this is Exit.
Yeah.
And this band began before Wally was killed?
Yeah. I mean, that began in
So that was more of an
Early-
art band than a.
Yeah?
That was more of an art band than a punk band.
Yeah, it came out of art. I mean, punk wasn't heard of in those days, but then neither was punk heard of when punk started, because punk was a sort of, invention in a way. There's lots of people doing that sort of. I mean, for God's sake, to my mind, the greatest punk artist of them all was John Coltrane. With his audience of Black Panthers. Well, I mean, shit me, you can't get more punk than that. Crass was born, out of that anger. And that anger has remained untouched and unsullied in, the last 40 years of my existence. I'm still as angry. I mean, I'm not angry solely about Wally. I'm angry about the fact that nothing's changed. In fact, it's become more specialised, more immediate, more effective.
So you, because I think we differ on this. I don't doubt what happened to Wally, but I don't see that as possible today. But you think the government today, the British government, is just as capable as of this sort of individual assassination?
There's absolutely no question. And it's ridiculous I forget his name. But there was a very specific case recently, about 5 years back, of one of the experts involved in investigating the threat of weapons of mass destruction, who was a doctor, who had conclusive proof that, his view, carried by his proof, was that there were not weapons of mass destruction, and he had more information, etc., etc., etc. And basically speaking, he went for a walk one day and committed suicide. It still happens. I know it happens. Even Middle England believed that had been an assassination. Nothing was done about it because nothing can be done about it. Of course it happens. The sort of Karen Silkwood syndrome, isn't it?
I don't know who Karen Silkwood is.
Well, she was an American woman who got information about the splits in the nuclear. It was 3 Mile Island, and she knew it was going to happen because she was working in the industry, and she tried to put out the warnings and got driven off the road.
So you began Crass after Wally's death with the rage of what had happened to him, and it had. This will sound weird to mainstream people, but it did kind of have a mainstream appeal compared to what you've done since then, your poetry and your books, and what you were doing before then. So it was kind of, comparative to your other work, it seems like it was a way to get to as many people as possible.
Well, that was more out of a combination of personalities. I mean, the personalities being Steve and myself, and that's why that happened. We both bent over backwards to accommodate each other.
There were some catchy numbers.
Yeah, there were. But, but it really was because, Steve really loathed my avant-gardism, to almost the degree I disliked his rock and roll. He was also a very pissed off guy, he was pissed off with everything. And, what working class kid who's got half an ounce of sense isn't going to be pissed off? And so we met up. He was really young. I was considerably older, but, we just hit it off together. And so the combination of sort of my essential avant-gardism and his essential sort of, like teenage rock and roll, his teenage rebellion, is a very catchy number. You put intelligence to that sort of energy and you've got something that's dangerous. And that's precisely what Crass was. Huh?
Steve wasn't intelligent.
He was hugely intelligent, but that his intelligence was a form of intelligence I didn't have.
Yeah.
Street intelligence. You put street intelligence together with sort of informed intelligence. And I don't mean that he wasn't informed, but the middle classes essentially have always had all of the information. It's just that they don't use it. They can't use it. They wouldn't know how to use it. They don't want to use it because they're comfortable. Right. You put that with working class anger and you've really got something. And that's why Crass was what it was. And it was unique in that as well.
I've heard people say that about rock and roll. It's the the rhythm of slavery combined with the rage of the Irish.
Mm-hmm.
So do you feel like, I feel you had this sort of avant-garde art career, then Wally died, then there was Crass till 84, and then it went back to equally esoteric kind of art stuff. Do you feel like in 84 there was a decision that, all right, I've made Wally's point?
No, because even if you listen to Crass, that aspect is strongly there. I mean, it's rock and roll with this strange, distortion, which my drumming in itself, which is anti-rock. So there was this peculiar sound there, and that, as time progressed within the band, I was allowed more and more space as people, basically became less and less whatever it was. But the input from other people in the band came less over time. I kept up the pressure. So increasingly, if you listen to the body of Crass's work, it becomes more and more avant-garde until you end up with 10 notes on a summer's day, which absolutely no one can fucking listen to. But for me, it wasn't any ever different. If I'd have been the vocalist and I'd have been the mouthpiece all the time, on stage, it wouldn't have happened. But because Steve brought his passion with him, that's what people saw, but they heard these different words.
They heard middle-class vocabulary with a working-class accent.
Yeah. So the kids who were coming to our gigs were unbelievably receptive to very complex ideas. I mean, things like Reality Asylum is quite a complex piece of work. And people weren't saying to me, "Oh, why are you talking upside down, backwards, and piles of shit?" They were really into the sort of, the metaphors, the riddles, the.
Well, I think Steve Ignorant tries to pretend that he was just going along for the ride and didn't even know what he was singing, but I think that's a bit of a game.
It is a game. Yeah, of course it is.
He's a lot smarter than
He's incredibly smart. He's a very sharp guy.
So, would you say now, 40 years since Wally's death, that you're still traumatized by this? It still affects you deeply?
I don't think you could be not. I think traumatized might be a bit extreme, but maybe it isn't. No, I mean, I'm deeply hurt. And if you're deeply hurt, you remain deeply hurt. There's no cure to that. There's nothing in my rage that could ever, resolve or absolve that, and my absolute hatred of the elite who can so mindlessly do that, remains constant. That rage will never be calmed. And I wouldn't want it to be either.
Let's have a toast to Wally.
Yes, I'll have water. Yeah, that's a good idea.
May his crazy struggle be eternal.
Yes, I think it will be. Cheers. Cheers.
Ian, thanks, man.
Pleasure.